Thank you very much indeed. Thank you to the State of Qatar. A privilege to be here for this very important event. A privilege to have listened to such distinguished discussions and conversations, as well as the keynote from the Prime Minister. I'm somebody who has witnessed firsthand the hand of Qatar in linking its humanitarian assistance, for which I'm, of course, engaged, to the vital priority of resolving conflicts that we've heard so clearly from Mohammed al-Makhrifi as well as from the Prime Minister. Qatar's not just potential, but Qatar's actual role in defining what I've referred to as humanitarian diplomacy, which brings those two aspects together, is seminal, and I say that as somebody engaged in humanitarian work, but with a background in mediation. So thank you very much to Qatar for what it does for the world, as well as to bringing us here. Excellencies, we once had a dream that we could come together to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, that we could develop friendly relations between nations, strengthen peace, and solve international problems, that we could have justice, respect for international law, and a world in which we uphold respect for fundamental human rights and freedoms and the dignity and worth of the human person. And you know, like I do, where those words come from. And yet over the past 3 years, as the Emergency Relief Coordinator of the Humanitarian System, as well as head of the UN Humanitarian Office, indeed going back further as a multilateralist many times in the UN and out of it, and as a humanitarian and a mediator, I have witnessed, as you have, how persistent competition, animosity, and aggression between nations has prevented that dream from becoming a reality for far too many people. How strategic competition has been the hidden and not so hidden hand behind the outbreak of seemingly endless conflicts, and how it has stymied efforts to prevent and resolve conflict. In the last year, as we have been hearing, we have seen the outbreak of unimaginably devastating tragedies and trauma in Gaza and in Sudan. And that at a time when the Ukraine war remains a raging concern. In both Gaza and Sudan, civilians are paying the very highest price every single day, today, perhaps even more than other days, while we fail to reach consensus on solutions. And in Gaza, more than 35,000 Palestinians have now been killed in these 6-7 months, many more injured. Hundreds of thousands have been displaced, many of them serially, searching for safety where little safety exists and where hunger and the threat of the disease continue to escalate. And as I have said recently publicly, our concerns about the anxieties of where a Rafah operation would go are tragically concerns confirmed by events. In Sudan, for over a year, people have faced an inferno of brutal violence. We have reports of horrific atrocities, ethnically motivated violence, and gender-based violence. Millions have been displaced, and famine, this is my world, famine is now on the horizon for an extraordinary potential of 5 million people. I don't think there has been such a threat imposed by famine in decades. In Syria, people are facing the worst humanitarian situation in more than 13 years of terrible war. It's not remembered. Syria has more people below the poverty line each year of this war. Its economy is in ruins, its people displaced, its country divided. In Ukraine, 10 years of war, and more than 2 years since Russia's full-scale and ongoing invasion, approaching 10 years of war in my dear Yemen, and many more combined years of conflict and instability in places such as Afghanistan, the countries of the Sahel, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Haiti, and Somalia. And I could go on. In many of these places, strategic competition is not only preventing the resolution of conflict, it is fueling it, with powerful countries in every region arming or otherwise supporting warring parties or protecting them from international restraint. And beyond conflict, we have seen how strategic competition and economic protectionism has prevented an adequate collective response to the climate, to the COVID-19 pandemic, and to persistent economic and social inequality. And our growing connectedness and interdependence have magnified many of these challenges. So climate change, driven by activity in developed and developing countries, is having the most deleterious impact on those who did the least to cause it, often thousands and thousands of miles away from the places of cause. Following the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we saw the consequences on food security of millions of people around the world. Mass displacement of people has put pressure on host countries and communities and has been seized on as a pretext for divisive politics, further fragmenting international cohesion. And the highly connected global information space means that malign actors are much more easily able to affect situations in disparate places, with misinformation and disinformation sowing further division, stoking conflict, and putting the security of civilians, my own colleagues in the humanitarian community, and our operations at risk. And the result of all this is that over the last few years, humanitarian needs have grown exponentially. This year, we estimate 300 million people are in need across the globe of humanitarian assistance, and of course we've never come near that figure before. Displacement, food insecurity, and malnutrition are all at historically high levels. Inequality and poverty, I quoted Syrian case, persist. And we're witnessing an increasing surge in health emergencies and, of course, in impunity. And I'm reminded about impunity by reference to health because of the pandemic of attacks on health institutions in conflict, as my colleague Dr. Tedros has often described. So as you can see, I'm not sugarcoating what is a desperate situation, but I do believe there is hope. I have hope because I have the fortunate privilege of seeing the places of darkness and tragedy and sorrow. And in these places we see also the light of humanity. And I believe that light still burns brightly. We see this in the generosity of host communities, those communities to which displaced people have moved to find safety, and who are always helped first by host communities and then by the international community, who share everything with them. I remember visiting a small township in Burkina Faso a year ago. 300,000 people had descended on that small township of 80,000 people, and those 80,000 people cut off now by the war with the Al-Qaeda insurgent group in that part of Burkina Faso. Those 80,000 had shared their food, their assets, their capital with their surprising visitors until there was no food left to share, and the mothers in that community walked out each night across the front lines to find leaves and salt because there were no longer leaves in their village, to feed their own children as well as those of their new neighbors. Humanity exists everywhere with the same force and power that it always have. I have hope because I know there are many among you who still believe in the multilateral system to which I am engaged, who give all to that grand idea that I read at the beginning of the United Nations, the Charter. Those who engage in humanitarian diplomacy, fund humanitarian action, and as I said, like Qatar, who see the links between these two. And we have recently defined humanitarian diplomacy, which is so commonplace and important in these parlous times, as having three elements. Firstly, the negotiations, like we're seeing now in Sudan, to create the opportunities for agencies and communities to have access to health and other forms of humanitarian aid. Secondly, the mediation. We heard from Dr. McCluffy, the mediation that ends battles or ends wars. And thirdly, the promotion of the humanitarian principles which underpins both those forms of activity. I have hope because in the fiercest of conflicts, humanitarian diplomacy has appealed to the common good. I had the privilege of being involved in the mediation for the United Nations of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, where at a time of angry enmity and war and the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, those two parties, with the help of Turkey and of course the United Nations, came together for an agreement to protect the global need for food security. And they said to me very often in that mediation that it is because this is for the global good that they were able to go through and eventually achieve that agreement, and we hope that agreement may yet be renewed. We also see its diplomacy and hope in local forces allowing aid through to help people who are not under their control but under the control of their enemy. And what has given me the most clearest evidence of hope in the past 3 years is the courage and determination of the humanitarian community. Workers, international and national, many of them local community humanitarians, particularly important on the front lines in Sudan, those people in the emergency rooms in Khartoum who did not leave their homes, who are still there, who are finding aid somehow to protect and feed and support their communities. These are remarkable people. These are our heroes, and we know that they die in greater numbers today. We have seen it obviously in Gaza, but we've seen it elsewhere. As humanitarian needs continue to rise, for all the reasons I've outlined, and as funding fails to keep pace, the world is not a rich place, despite the generosity of many, many governments, many here today, and indeed of Qatar, our host. We all do continue to strive to make the world better. We have not lost that dream that I started with. And at the heart of these efforts is a resolve to do a simple thing, to do something of the greatest simplicity, and that is to listen to our neighbor, to listen to the people who know what they need and who know what they deserve, to listen to them and to be guided by them and to be driven by their voices. And it was absolutely clear in the conversation with Dr. Al-Maklefi that Qatar's approach to mediation, and indeed I would say to humanitarian diplomacy, is indeed to put first not necessarily the political position of the state of Qatar, but the opportunities for meeting the needs of peoples to be at the heart of the way that they approached difficult negotiations. I wish them very well, and I'm sure we all do. And I end by saying that humanity is not smaller today than it ever was. Humanity will outlive the decisions of bad leaders. Humanity remains the beacon that will drive us on. Thank you so much. Thank you.